The economic world of the historical Jesus. Many people imagine the era of Jesus merely as a spiritual atmosphere, sandals, sermons, miracles, and moral plays set in a distant past. However, for the people living in that era, daily life was shaped not by theology but directly by money, or rather the lack thereof. The world into which the historical Jesus was born was built by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. Welcome to this profound story where money, power, and history collide. Because nothing is ever as simple as it seems. In the early 1st century, Judea was within the borders of the Roman Empire. Rome was the most sophisticated wealth extraction machine ever established up to that point. Rome did not conquer to integrate territories, but solely to finance the wealth at the center. The sole purpose of the provinces was to funnel wealth from the outside in. The flow of grain, silver, and slaves ran ceaselessly from the borders toward Rome. Judea was one of the most fragile links in this chain of exploitation. This situation was extremely critical because Judea was not a wealthy region. It had a fragile agrarian and rural structure. Most people lived on small plots of land that were barely enough for their survival. A bad harvest did not mean a drop in profits. It meant direct starvation, and Rome had no conscience to care about this. Rome ruled Judea through local elites and imperial officials. While kings like Herod the Great ruled with Roman approval, after his death, governors like Pontius Pilate were tasked with maintaining order and securing the flow of taxes. The priority was not the welfare of the people, but order and the flow of revenue. Taxes were the backbone of this ruthless system. This is precisely where we confront some unsettling truths. Today, taxes are generally levied on income or growth. In Judea, however, tax had to be paid regardless of what you harvested from the land. You were taxed simply for existing. Land, crop, poll, and road taxes were multiplied by religious taxes piled on top of imperial obligations. The price of missing a single payment was heavy. There was no mechanism for appeal. The business of tax collection was outsourced to local contractors who paid Rome upfront and then ruthlessly exploited the public to turn a profit. Abuse was not a bug in the system. It was its very driving force. Those who could not pay had to borrow, and these debts carried no collateral protections or restructuring opportunities. As interest rates multiplied rapidly, your only collateral was your land. A single bad harvest could drag a family into a debt spiral from which they could never escape. The process usually went like this. The weather would turn bad, the harvest would fail, but taxes still had to be paid. The farmer would borrow from temple-affiliated elites or wealthy landowners. Interest would accumulate, the next year's harvest would not cover the debt, and eventually the land would be confiscated. The farmer would become a tenant on his own land or be enslaved. Over time, this structural design led to the concentration of land in a few hands and the accumulation of wealth among elites tied to Roman authority. The majority, meanwhile, was driven into precarity. The economy did not just produce poverty, it reproduced it every single time. Moreover, there was no social safety net. The only refuge for a family that lost its land was its own solidarity. Community aid was limited. When too many people collapsed at the same time, the system offered no solutions. Debt was not just a financial burden, but a social catastrophe. It meant losing status, security, and identity. Your family's future could be erased by a single drought or a single unpaid tax. This was exactly the world into which Jesus was born. Most people were poor not because they were lazy or immoral, but because the system dictated that they remain poor. Rome needed surplus value, the elites needed rents, and the temple needed revenue. All this relentless pressure rested on the shoulders of the people with the narrowest margin of error. This inevitably generated immense social tension. Judea was never peaceful. It was like a powder keg ready to explode at any moment. Rebellions flared up constantly, and banditry was viewed not as a crime, but as a struggle for economic survival. Messianic movements promising people that justice and order would be overturned flourished during these periods of collapse. This is the biggest point that modern observers miss. When people listen to sermons about the forgiveness of debts, justice, and freedom, they did not view them as abstract metaphors. These words were directly about the struggle for economic survival. When the poor were mentioned, it was not a distant sentiment of pity. It referred to their neighbors, their families, and themselves. The word forgiveness meant more than spiritual cleansing. It meant the cancellation of debts and liberation from slavery. Yet liberation rarely occurred. The Roman system was built to be efficient, not humane. Stability was far more important than justice, and tax revenues far more valuable than human life. This is why Judea had become an unbreathable place. People worked harder but sank deeper. Growth did not increase everyone's prosperity. It only lifted a lucky few while dragging everyone else to the bottom. Everyone was aware of this injustice. No one believed that hard work would guarantee security. There was only patience, accumulating anger, and a hope for deliverance that would break this cycle. This hope is precisely where dangerous ideas are born. When the system is squeezed this tight, Even words are enough to shake the order. By the time Jesus began to speak, economic pressure had already reached unbearable levels. The audience was ready, the cracks in the system were glaringly obvious, and people's desperation rested on a highly rational foundation. This economic picture was not just a backdrop, it was the engine of history itself. To understand why the Judean economy turned into such an inescapable trap, one must look at the largest institution of all, the one everyone believed would protect them, the temple. Today, the temple in Jerusalem is imagined merely as a religious center. Economically, however, the temple was the largest and most powerful financial institution in the region. It did not just shape faith, it controlled vast amounts of money. Besides being sacred, the temple functioned as a treasury, a bank, a tax office, and a court. Every adult Jewish male was obligated to pay a temple tax every year. This was not a voluntary or symbolic payment. The tax had to be paid in a specific Tyrian shekel with a fixed silver purity. Local or Roman coins were not accepted. This forced people to exchange the currency they held. Money changers ran this business on commissions. Transaction fees were integrated directly into the system. Sacrificial animals were sold at temple-approved, exorbitant prices. Even the poor had to participate in this gear by offering small sacrifices. Religion did not alleviate Rome's tax burden. On the contrary, it imposed a new layer of taxation on top of it. The greatest contradiction here was that the temple elites were in deep collaboration with Roman authority. High priests did not attain their offices through spiritual merit, but directly through Roman approval and appointment. Stability was preferred over honesty, and collaboration over justice. Consequently, this institution, which claimed moral authority over the people, was simultaneously feeding directly off the logic of exploitation that impoverished them. This created immense hypocrisy. The temple preached holiness and forgiveness, but its practices reinforced debt, inequality, and exclusion. Accessing God required money, purification demanded sacrifices, and forgiveness required payments to the temple. Those without money were left dependent on charity, but these alms lacked the power to relieve systemic pressure or restore lost lands. By the 1st century, the anger felt toward the temple leadership had grown like an avalanche. This anger was not directed at faith itself, but at this mechanism of exploitation carried out under the guise of religion. Jesus did not remain outside this system, he addressed its very core. When he spoke of the forgiveness of debts, the people understood it in the literal sense of economic liberation. When he spoke of the poor, they saw themselves. And when he spoke of the kingdom of God, they heard an alternative model of living where the existing unjust order would be overturned. This was why his words were so disruptive. However, words alone are not enough to overthrow the established order. Action is required. Jesus did not attack Rome directly, that would have been suicide. Instead, he targeted the legitimacy of the system. By redefining values, he made people question who deserved authority. We can now better understand why economic terms, debt, wages, vinedressers, servants, masters, creditors, constantly appeared in his teachings. These were not randomly chosen metaphors, they were life itself. And then came that great action that changed everything, the temple clearing. Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple was not just a burst of religious anger, it was a direct economic rebellion. It targeted the financial wheel that monetized access to the sacred, defining it as a den of robbers. This action meant crossing a red line. Rome could tolerate prophet, teachers, and even dissenting thinkers. But the one thing it could never tolerate was instability. The temple rulers knew how dangerous unrest would be during Passover when Jerusalem was overflowing with pilgrims. In their eyes, Jesus was not just preaching. He was disrupting the money flow, shaking legitimacy, and upsetting the delicate balances that secured both their own power and Rome's satisfaction. The essence of the matter was this: the conflict was not theological, but entirely economic and political. The system could tolerate poverty, but it could never allow a narrative that caused people to question why this suffering was necessary. Because once people stop viewing debt as destiny, maintaining exploitation becomes difficult. At that time, Judea was practically a pressure cooker. Taxes, lost lands, debts, and religious obligations had combined, and a breaking point had been reached. Rebellion was not a possibility, it was only a matter of time. Rome, however, responded to this pressure with its usual brutal methods. After Jesus, the system did not collapse, on the contrary, it grew even harsher. A generation later, Judea went completely up in flames. The Great Rebellion that began in 66 CE ended in 70 CE with the siege of Jerusalem and the complete destruction of the temple. The temple treasury was looted, the priestly class was annihilated, and hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered or exiled. Rome did not just suppress the rebellion, it wiped off the map the entire infrastructure that made resistance possible. Yet this destruction did not end exploitation, it only made it more bureaucratic. Roman taxes grew heavier and large landowners grew even more powerful. In the short term, Rome had won a decisive military victory, but controlling the land was not the same as controlling the mind and the narrative. Jesus had not led an army, nor had he promised a new tax policy or land reform. The impact he created could not be measured by regime changes. What he shattered was that obsolete belief that exploitation was inevitable, deserved, and sacred. By stating that debt was not a moral failure, and by placing the poor at the center of the system, he shook the very thing Rome needed most: consent and legitimacy. Empires can cope with pain, but they collapse when people stop believing that this pain is an inevitable price of the order. After the temple was destroyed, the order Jesus criticized did not vanish, but neither was his critique buried in history. In the years that followed, alternative communities were established, living within the empire but without surrendering to its moral economy. Practices of solidarity such as shared resources, mutual aid, and the cancellation of debts formed the foundation of these communities. These communities did not launch an armed revolution. They merely offered a quiet but profound alternative, showing that another life was possible. Rome always suppressed armed rebellions, but it could never destroy this quiet revolution of the mind. For this struggle required no land, temples, or treasuries. It spread with humanity, growing stronger under oppression. And over time, something unexpected happened. Rome never fully regained control over the narrative people told themselves about power, debt, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, rather than destroying this alternative moral framework, the empire absorbed it. In doing so, it actually acknowledged a deep truth. Authority could no longer be based solely on brute force. Moral legitimacy was essential even for power. The economy of Jesus' era shows us a striking truth. Systems do not collapse simply because they are unjust. They fall when the narratives that legitimize them lose their credibility. Rome had perfected exploitation, but it could never remedy the moral ruin it created. And this is the real lesson. Economic systems packaged in moral rhetoric are highly resilient. They resist hardships, anger, and even rebellions for a long time. But the moment they lose the faith of the masses, they cannot stand. The moment people realize that this pain is not necessary, deserved, or meaningful, that great fracture occurs. History does not repeat itself, but it lays out similar patterns before us. Once you realize how power defends itself not just with weapons but with narratives, believing those stories will no longer be as easy as before. If this analysis has expanded your horizon, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. History always holds the right answers, you just need to know where to look.